Thank you for joining us for our program today. I hope everyone is staying both healthy and cool in these warmer days. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Today, Mary Beth Norton will give us a talk on her new book, A Narrative History of the Long Year of 1774, or the months from December 1773 to April 1775. This period has tended to be overlooked by historians who focus instead on the War for Independence, but as John Adams declared, the true revolution took place in the minds of the people before a shot was fired at Lexington. Norton argues that the year 1774 was when the revolution occurred. Our speaker this evening is Mary Beth Norton, the Mary Donlow Alger Professor of American History Emerita at Cornell University. She completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan and her PhD at Harvard University, where she worked extensively with Bernard Bailyn. Over the course of her career, she has authored 5 books and co-authored several others. These include Separated by Their Sex, Women in the Public and Private in Colonial Atlantic World, and In the Devil's Snare, The Salem Witch Trials of 1792. A textbook, which she wrote with 5 other authors, A People and a Nation, has been published in 10 editions and has sold more than 500,000 copies. Throughout her career, she has studied colonial history, gender, and women's history. She has also been a great supporter of fellow female historians. We are honored to host Professor Norton, but before we begin the program, I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. We are also continuing to offer a very active set of programs. We have public programs available throughout the summer, at least through the middle of August. And I would encourage everyone to check out our website or contact me or Sarah Bertulli, our public programs coordinator, to learn about the programs that we have scheduled. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Beth Norton for her presentation this evening.
Okay, I'd like to start with this slide, which expresses my own opinion of the year 1774. Come, my brave boys, from my song you shall hear that was crowned 74 a most glorious year. I concluded, while I was working on my doctoral dissertation long ago, that the year 1774 was an absolutely crucial year in the development of the American Revolution. It certainly was the year that created loyalism, and it created loyalists, which were the subject of my dissertation. In the book, 1774, my purpose is somewhat unusual. I try to narrate the events of 1774 neutrally, to understand and interpret what happened as contemporaries would have, to give voice not only to radicals, but also to their critics, whether those men and women were moderate conservative supporters of resistance or ended up as loyalists. What I want to do in the book is to present Americans' dialogues about politics in 1774 even-handedly, and I don't forecast the outcome. I'd really like readers to forget, while they're reading the book, what happened at the end of the year, at the end of what I call the long year of 1774, that is in April 1775. So I try not to forecast what's going to happen. So I narrate in detail the events of the long 1774 from December of 1773 through the preface of October 1773, which I'll explain shortly, to mid-April of 1775, to share how colonists, who all saw themselves as loyal subjects of King George III and part of the empire in 1773, divided into groups, one of which persisted in that loyalty. And as I said, loyalists that term was invented during the year 1774. You can't have loyalists until you have disloyalists. And then to a second group that began to favor independence. And I want to underscore that. It's really important for us to understand that at the end of 1773, pretty much everybody in the colonies was loyal to the empire. So what happens in 1774 is that situation changes. So in the book, I deal with all the colonies that eventually joined the United States. The book also focuses very intensively on America, rather than shifting the narrative at one point or another off to let me see if I can get it full screen. Yeah, there we go. Off to London, as many of the books do when they talk about this period. Now, obviously, in the short time I have this afternoon, I can't discuss or summarize all my research. And so what I've decided to do is to focus on a thread that some of the early reviewers of the book have already remarked upon, and that's the importance of tea, especially that coming from the East India Company. This thread will start with familiar and unfamiliar events in late 1773, but then will take us far afield into other colonies with the same theme over the next 40 minutes or so. Now, the story that everybody knows about is of the Boston Tea Party. But what you might not know is that the Boston Tea Party was not called that until 1826. This was discovered not by me, but by my colleague at Cornell, Larry Glickman, in a history of consumer activism in America. But of course, more cities than Boston were involved in 1773. The East India Company sent 7 tea ships to America in 1773. 4 went to Boston, and 1 each went to New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Now, a brief background is necessary before I can talk about what happened when the tea got to North America. The Tea Act was adopted by Parliament in the spring of 1773 to get the East India Company out of financial difficulties. It was facing bankruptcy for 2 reasons. One was because of mismanagement. The East India Company was the legal British monopoly of tea with, not with of tea, but of trade with Asia. It had been founded in 1600, and it was a company that had major mismanagement issues. But also because of rampant smuggling. The chief competitor of the East India Company was the Dutch East India Company, and the Dutch East India Company imported the same kinds of things into Europe as the British East India Company did. And many people bought smuggled items both in the home country and in North America, from the Dutch as well as from the British. So the Americans were prodigious tea drinkers. That's a word that was used at the time. And they usually drank smuggled tea because a lot of that tea came through the Dutch West India Company. It was widely known as Dutch tea, whether or not it actually came from the Netherlands directly or from somewhere else. And if it came from somewhere else, the place it mostly came from was this place. It's a very obscure Dutch island. It's now an independent nation known as Statia. It's in the far northeastern part of the Caribbean, easily accessible from both Europe and North America. This was a major smuggler's haven in the period. The 2 extinct volcanoes you see in the background provided shelter to the roadstead. It did not have a harbor as such, but it had a very sheltered anchorage, and literally hundreds of ships could anchor there. I have been there. I've gone there because I knew it was so important to illegal trade in the colonial period. And I have to say, I was stunned by the fact that there was no harbor. I thought there was going to be a great harbor there, but there isn't. There's just this sheltered anchorage. And it's because the island was so nicely situated for people coming from both North America and from Europe. The Dutch didn't care if people were smuggling things into the North American colonies from there, or to anywhere else for that matter. And so as a result, it was a real thorn in the side of the East India Company and of the Dutch and of the British as well. So St. Eustatius is a very, very interesting place and little known today. This is a contemporary picture from the 18th century. Now, the Tea Act, which was adopted by Parliament in the spring of 1773, was very complex and hard to understand. In fact, when it was first published in the colonies, they had there were many misunderstandings, actually, of what was contained in the act. But the important thing is, for us, is the key aim of the act. It was to lower the tax on legal East India Company tea in the colonies, so that East India Company tea could compete with smuggled Dutch tea. The smuggled tea sold for about half or 2/3 of the price of legal tea. And the East India Company decided that if they lowered the tax, the export tax that was being paid when tea was exported from England to the colonies, that would, as we might say, make a closer price point, perhaps, to the smuggled tea in the colonies, and that they would convince people that the East India Company tea was of better quality than Dutch tea, and so people would be more likely to buy it, and therefore they would do better in their business. Now, I want you to understand the irony here, of course, because our understanding of the Tea Act, or of the protests in Boston and other places at the time, is we think of it today as a protest against higher taxes, but actually it was a protest against lower taxes. It was a protest against against Parliament lowering the tax on East India Company tea. Because what the Americans were concerned about was not so much the tea tax itself, or the amount of the tax. They were concerned about the symbolism of the tea tax. They did not think that Parliament should be able to tax them, and that was the issue. They were opposed to the symbolism of the tea tax. So it was not until, as I said, the Tea Act was passed in May of 1773. It took the East India Company a while to get its act together and to send ships with tea to the colonies. They did not leave the English ports until late September, actually, of 1773. And the Americans did not find out that the tea ships were coming until October of 1773. And this is my preface to what I call it, the long year of 1773. This is when the colonists learned that the tea ships were coming. When they learned this, essayists in New York City and Philadelphia, note, not Boston. Boston was a laggard. We tend to think of Boston as being the height of the of opposition to tea, but in fact, this was not true in October of 73. It was New York and Philadelphia that were the hotbeds of opposition to the idea of East India Company tea coming directly to the colonies. So in October, men in New York City and Philadelphia wrote essays in the newspapers suggesting 3 different anti-tea tactics. One was to persuade, and I put that in quotation marks because what they really meant was to coerce the people who were going to receive the tea into refusing it. These men were called consignees. They were favored by the East India Company. They were to receive the tea and then distribute it in the colonies. So the assumption was that if you persuaded the consignees to resign, there could be no one to sell or distribute the tea, and therefore it would not be a problem. So one of the tactics that was proposed was to persuade the consignees to resign. Another tactic was to propose agreements of merchants and people not to buy or consume the tea. Assuming that the tea arrived, what you would do would be persuade people not to buy it. And so that was a second tactic. The third, which was proposed by Benjamin Rush, who was at that time a prominent young physician in Philadelphia, and who, as many of you know, I'm sure, became a leader of the revolution ultimately. He proposed trying to prevent the tea from landing in the first place. Now, all 3 of these tactics were tried in 1773 and again in 1774 at different locations. Some of them worked better than others. And a 4th tactic was developed in 1774, which was to turn the tea over, to confiscate it in effect from the ships in which it came, and to turn it over to local authorities to do with as they wished. or to do something with it. It was sort of unclear when the tea was turned over to the local authorities what would happen to that tea. Sometimes, as we now know, some of it was much later sold to support the Revolutionary War effort. But in addition, part of it was doled out to local people who asked the authorities for tea to drink for health purposes. So, and in fact, one of the wonderful sources that I found for this book was a series of little slips of paper, literally little slips of paper, that are at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California. And they are requests for tea. They're requests from people who say, I need tea, or my neighbor needs tea, or I'm sick, or whatever, and they're asking the authorities in a little town in Connecticut to give the tea. It's amazing that these slips asking tea were saved all these years and that they ended up somehow in the Huntington. I don't know the answer to that question, but it would be very interesting to find out. It was one of the more interesting sources that I found. Now, the event that we all know about is, of course, the Boston Tea Party, when the landing of the tea was opposed by its destruction from three ships in the harbor. I talk at length in about the Boston Tea Party in the book, but I won't talk about it now, though I will answer questions about it later if you want it. What I do want to do is to show you a slide which shows the earliest known image of the Boston Tea Party. Forget the poor guy being tarred and feathered in the foreground. The important part of this image, for my purposes, is the image of the Tea Party in the background. This was drawn by a British cartoonist in 1774. And he might have talked to people who had been in Boston, because there were people who in London at the time this cartoon was drawn, of people who had been in Boston who possibly witnessed the Tea Party. And so this is the closest image that we have in hand to a contemporary view of the Boston Tea Party. Note that the men in question are not disguised in any way, as far as you can tell, but they are tossing chests of tea overboard from this vessel on the side there of the main image. And if anybody wants to talk about the guy who's being tarred and feathered, I'm happy to answer that question too, but that's not my point in showing the image. Okay, so that's Boston, at least briefly. What about the other cities? One of the things that's not well known, and in fact, I taught the Revolution for 40 years without realizing this, but the tea ship arrived in Charleston at almost exactly the same time as the tea ships arrived in Boston. So Charleston and Boston were dealing with EICT at exactly the same time. And one of the things I do in the first chapter of the book is to go back and forth in the narrative from Boston to Charleston and talk about what's happening basically week by week, what happened this week in Boston and the same week in Charleston. What happened in Charleston is very different from what happened in Boston, and that's why nobody knows what happened about it. What happened there now is because although people in Boston rather quickly reached a consensus that they wanted to stop the tea from being unloaded, that is adopting Benjamin Rush's suggestion, in Charleston, they just couldn't make up their minds. They had several large meetings, they had several small meetings. And not only did they have difficulty reaching consensus in those meetings, after the meetings, they had difficulty reaching consensus about what they had decided. So in the end, what the people in Charleston did was to collude in the confiscation of the tea by customs officials. And here I have to talk briefly about what customs law was at the time, which is in fact why the Boston Tea Party happened at the time that it did on the 16th of December. In 1773. The customs laws said that a ship, once it had entered the harbor, had to pay duty on its cargo within 20 days, or the cargo would be confiscated for non-payment of duty. Now, the 20th day in Boston would have been the 17th of December, so that's why the groups went to the tea ships on the night of the 16th, was to prevent the customs officers from trying to confiscate it on the 17th. However, in Charleston, the people just simply colluded with the customs officers in the in the confiscation of the tea. They literally stood around on the wharf and watched the customs officers unload the tea. And where they stored it was, I'll show you on another slide. They shored it. This is a slide of Charleston Harbor from the 18th century. And the large building here in the middle, between, if you can see it, it's between the two spires, the two church spires, is the Mercantile Exchange, which was a large building on Charleston Harbor. You can still visit it today. It still exists. And that's where the meetings were held to discuss whether to, what to do about the tea. And it's where the tea was stored after it was confiscated. I have to say that it was stored in not very good conditions in the basement of the Charleston Mercantile Exchange. So it was not stored well. A lot of it rotted away as far as we know, but what was saved was in fact later on sold for the purposes of the Revolution. This was several years later. So that's Boston and that's Charleston. But then what happened in Philadelphia and New York? Well, as I said, people in Charleston and people in Boston were dealing with the tea at the same time. And because of the difficulties of communication along the coast, they didn't know what was happening in the other place. But what happened in Philadelphia was that they learned what had happened in Boston because Paul Revere rode into town with the news of what had happened in Boston literally the day before the tea ship arrived in Philadelphia, sailing up the Delaware River and arrived outside the port of Philadelphia. So the people in Philadelphia knew that they did not want to get into the same kind of hassle that had happened in Boston, that is having to deal with the 20-day deadline. They did not know, by the way, what had happened in Charleston, even though it had already happened by the time the ship arrived in Philadelphia. So they intercepted the captain on the way into the port, and they persuaded him, it is said, who knows what they said, they convinced him that it would not be a good idea to enter his ship into the port. And so he decided to acquiesce in what was asked of him by the local members of the Philadelphia Committee. And so he agreed to resupply the ship and sail back to England, which he did. The same thing happened in New York, but it was different because in New York, the tea ship did not arrive until late April of 1774. That was because it was blown off course by a North Atlantic gale, and it ended up spending the winter in Antigua. So the tea ship captain, who was going to go to New York, knew very well what had happened in Philadelphia and Charleston and Boston, and he didn't want to get into any of that. And so he wrote ahead to New York, saying to the New Yorkers, I have to, under my contract, come to New York, but don't worry, I'm not going to try to enter the port. I'll just resupply the ship and I will sail back to England, which is exactly what happened. He landed at Perth Amboy, New Jersey. He resupplied the ship. He took off. He went back to England, and everybody, there's this wonderful scene in the newspapers of everybody standing on the wharf, waving him goodbye, saying, have a great voyage, saying he's a really genteel guy, and wasn't he nice? So that's the end of what happened in New York. Now, that's 6 ships. I've told you about 6 ships, but what about the 7th ship? Because I said there were 7 ships, and there were 4 sent to Boston. Well, the 4th ship sent to Boston never got there. It wrecked on Cape Cod. It wrecked in, I think, the very same North Atlantic gale that blew the ship that was going to New York down to Antigua. So some of the chests that were damaged remained on Cape Cod when the other damaged chests were sent up to Boston. They were sent to the British headquarters on Castle William in the island on the island off the coast, in the harbor of Boston, and eventually that tea was sold too, but it was sold by the British before the evacuation of Boston in 1776. So I discuss what happened on the Cape in the book. It's very complicated. I will just say briefly that it was chaotic because all of a sudden there were several large chests of East India Company tea that arrived on the Cape, and people wanted to buy it. It had not been taxed. It was not going to be taxed. So they said it doesn't matter that it's from the East India Company. Other people said, oh yes, it matters it's from the East India Company. You shouldn't buy it because it's from the East India Company, whether it's been taxed or not. This led to competing town meetings in the town of Eastham. It led to attacks by mobs on a merchant in Provincetown who had acquired some of the salvaged tea. It led to chaos, literally. It led to attacks on local officials who were trying to facilitate the selling of the tea. And in the end, or not so much in the end, the authorities on the island, or on the Cape, sent a note to Boston, and they said to the Committee of Correspondence, please tell us, Committee of Correspondence, what we should do with the tea. And they waited for months for an answer. And finally, the Committee of Correspondence responded, use your own best judgment. So this obviously didn't help the people on the Cape making a decision very much, but they decided to allow the tea to be sold. So it was sold, and in fact was the only tea from the East India Company officially sent in 1773 that was ever sold in the colonies. And that was obviously not an outcome that people elsewhere wanted. And so it gives us a sense of what might have happened if the tea had actually been landed anywhere else, but it wasn't. So now the British ministry and parliament obviously didn't like what had happened in any of these jurisdictions, but they primarily focused their punishment on Boston by adopting the Boston Port Act, which closed the port after the 1st of June until the tea was paid for. Now that move, you might think, would have led to defiant unity in Boston, but in fact it didn't. It led to deep divisions in the town. The town didn't even know about the Boston Port Act until the middle of May. So they had about 2 weeks to get used to the idea that the town was going to be shut down completely, except for the traffic that was allowed, the trade that was allowed, which was local traffic in food and fuel only to Boston. Other than that, everything was supposed to shut down. So it was a major attack on the economy of the Port of Boston. So what to do in response led to heated debates in newspapers and in 2 Boston town meetings, which lasted for a total of 3 days in the middle to late June of 1774. One newspaper essayist remarked accurately, and I want to quote him directly, he said, "Various as the colors in the rainbow are the opinions of the gentlemen in this town." And he was right. Some people said, we've got to pay for the tea. Some people said wealthy people should do it. Other people said the people who destroyed it should do it. Other people said all of Boston should pay. Some people said all of Massachusetts should pay. Some people said let's get contributions from other colonies to pay, and then we'll be able to reopen the port. And then there was an alternative, and that was a resistance, which was pursued by Samuel Adams and the Committee of Correspondence. And I want to share a screen with you, a picture you've probably not seen before of Samuel Adams. This is drawn by Paul Revere, and it is, of course, showing the resolute nature of this gentleman who was the firebrand in Boston who led the Committee of Correspondence. So the committee proposed, instead of paying for the tea and getting the town opened through that way, they proposed a non-consumption agreement. And again, another of the tactics that had been suggested in October of 73, a non-consumption agreement, which they circulated covertly to the towns. It was called the Solemn League and Covenant, and they didn't consult the town meeting first. And that caused great controversy. And it was a part of the controversy of those 3 days of town meetings that occurred in the middle and late June of 74. At these town meetings, some people argued vociferously for censuring Samuel Adams and censuring the committee for acting without authorization from the town. But in the end, the town meeting supported the committee but a substantial minority, probably about 25 people, 25% of the town meeting walked out of the meeting, and they later published their objections to the majority's opinion in the newspapers, and they published long statements in the newspapers about why they objected to the majority opinion. So they were a very vocal minority. But what this leads to is, it's important to note, is that very few newspapers, especially outside of New England, carried a full account of these debates and disagreements in Boston. Thus, they left colonists elsewhere with the mistaken impression that Bostonians were united in support of the destruction of the tea. This is not so much fake news, that is, they didn't make up stuff, but they omitted things, and that left a false impression in other people's minds. Now, what happened on the Cape showed how hard it was going to be to persuade people to stop drinking tea. And even if you stopped the ships from coming, merchants already had lots of tea in their storehouses, and individuals had lots of tea in their larders. And yet, foregoing tea throughout the year 1774, smuggled tea as well as the East India Company tea came to be seen as a symbol of opposition to Great Britain. And people argued, well, we can never be sure where the tea came from. Even if you're told it's smuggled, maybe it really is East India Company tea. So the closest way, or the easiest way to avoid breaking the boycott, as it were, was to not drink any tea at all. So therefore, one of the interesting things one sees in the newspapers throughout 1774 is a major campaign to get people, especially women, to stop buying and drinking tea. Why women? Well, women were known to entertain their friends at tea parties in the afternoon. Everybody drank tea all the time. It's like coffee today, but everybody drank tea all the time. But women especially socialized over tea. And so they thought that women were a market for tea and a special user of tea. And so a lot of these arguments were aimed at women. So how did they do that? Well, the newspapers are full of stories about wealthy matrons pledging not to drink tea. Today, we might think of these people as influencers in Instagram. That is, telling other people what they're going to do and trying to get other people to do it. Now, what's interesting is, even though the newspapers would say 60 wealthy matrons of Newport, Rhode Island, all sign an agreement not to serve tea in their household, you never ever see such agreements. You don't know whether these things are true or not. Did 60 wealthy matrons of Newport actually sign such an agreement? Who knows? But that was what was published in the newspapers. They also published recipes for making tea substitutes from American resources, like sassafras. There were public tea burnings. Lexington had one. Crowds were invited to come watch the tea being burned publicly. And of course, they had to be served something while they were watching the tea, so they were served copious amounts of alcohol. So these were great parties. Some towns adopted policies forbidding people from drinking tea in the town. And this was true in Falmouth, Maine, as John Adams found out when he, while riding the circuit in the summer of 1774, and very tired, he'd ridden all day. He was for about 30 miles in horseback, and he came to his inn in Falmouth, and he asked the innkeeper for a cup of tea that had been honestly smuggled. That's his phrase. And the innkeeper said, no, I can't serve you tea because the town has forbidden me from serving tea at any time in our town. And so he therefore had to drink coffee. And we know this story because he wrote about it to Abigail a few days later, and he told her that he was drinking coffee now, and he said, I am bearing it very well. So there were also poems in newspapers to stop people from drinking tea, and there were essays about how bad tea was for one's health. And I have to admit that I cannot resist these essays and sharing one of them with you, because I'm a tea drinker. I really don't drink coffee. And but there's a pamphlet called A Sermon on Tea, and the pamphlet author argued that that tea had, quote, reduced the robust habit of men to a feminine softness. And thus men were being turned into women, and women, quote, into God knows what. He informed young women that drinking tea would render them less attractive to men. He said it will, quote, suffuse your faces with a deadly paleness, making a regular consumer into, quote, a ghost-like, pale-faced specter. And he said every mother needed to be concerned about her, quote, unborn posterity, because he predicted that a tea drinker's children would die young, quote, a speedy martyr to her ill-judged diet, end quote. Now, there were some women who were having none of this. There were women who wrote essays in the papers in response to such stupid essays saying, just tell us you don't want us to drink tea for political reasons, and we're much more likely to do that than for doing this. But of course, because it was a major campaign, it also aroused major satires, and there were very verbal satires, of course, but there was also this very famous cartoon by the same guy who did the other cartoon I showed you earlier. Its official title is A Society of Patriotic Ladies, but it's actually known as the Edenton Ladies Tea Party. And it's based on an incident in Edenton, North Carolina, where a group of women gathered to actually support the revolution. They didn't really say anything much about tea, but because of the cultural involvement of women and tea, it was figured as a tea party. And in the background, you can see women pouring their tea into receptacles that other people are holding out. And the women, of course, at the meeting are very grotesque. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a neglected child, neglected by his mother, being harassed in some way by a dog, and the dog is in fact pissing on a tea chest. Well, but anyway, that's what he's pissing on. So that's an indication of the cartoonist's disgust for what's happening. Now, during the summer of 1774, meetings were held throughout the colonies to elect delegates to provincial congresses and the First Continental Congress. And the meetings also adopted resolutions about the current controversy and about the plight of Boston, and they pledged to aid Boston. And people who've written about what happened in these summer meetings have said, isn't it wonderful? They all pledged money and various support to Boston, and they did. They pledged various in-kind contributions, like there was a famous flock of sheep that got driven up from Connecticut and so forth to Boston to feed the hungry. But it's important to note that the other colonies and jurisdictions, in making their statements of support for Boston, generally did not support the destruction of the tea, although they criticized Britain's punishment of Boston. And a good way to illustrate this is from a famous quote from George Washington. George Washington is often quoted as saying, this is after he learned about the Boston Port Act, the cause of Boston is the cause of all America. But what most people who quote that sentence leave out is what follows it, the parenthetical phrase that he added, which is not that any of us approve the destruction of the tea. And that was, in fact, the attitude of people elsewhere. It was certainly the attitude of Benjamin Franklin, who was in London, and it was the attitude of, it's clear, in the county resolutions that were adopted in Virginia in 1774. There were 29 county resolutions that are recorded. The contents are recorded. Of those 29 county resolutions, only one explicitly supported Boston in destroying the tea. Another one explicitly attacked Boston for destroying the tea. 3 talked about it but waffled. They said, oh, we don't know. We can't figure out whether they were right or not, but Britain was wrong to punish them the way they have. All the rest maintained a discreet silence, never even mentioned the destruction of the tea at all. So that just shows that colonists elsewhere were really not very happy about what the Boston Tea Party had done. So therefore, it should not be surprising for you to learn that colonists continued to argue about whether the East India Company should be compensated for the tea until the First Continental Congress in September and October of 1774. Now, alas, the Continental Congress kept no record of the details of its debates. Sometimes we have some comments by people in their diaries or in a few letters about the content of debates, but this debate over whether to pay the East India Company for the tea was simply not recorded at all. We do know that after a long discussion, the Congress decided against reimbursing the company. Now, obviously, there are many other issues that are important in the summer and fall of 1774. I'm happy to answer questions about those. I don't have time to do that. Let me just comment that a one of the issues that has not gotten a lot of attention, I think, but which in my reading turned out to be very important, and that was one of the coercive acts, which is called the Administration of Justice Act officially. The colonists, on the other hand, called it the Murder Act. And that was the act that said that if a colonial official or a British soldier was accused of murdering a colonist who was causing trouble, that person would be tried in England rather than in America. And even future loyalists objected to that act. And in fact, I never found a future loyalist who defended it. No one was going to defend that act, which would have in fact moved the Boston massacre trials to England. Now, an initial indication of how badly the relationship between Britain and the colonies had deteriorated during 1774 came in early December. After learning of American ships in Europe seeking to buy arms and ammunition, which is events that I talk about in the book, George III issued an order in council on October 19th forbidding the export of arms and ammunition from Britain to the colonies for 6 months. The news of the order in council arrived in Rhode Island on December 8th, and the colonists immediately decided this meant war. And so it was also accompanied by an order from Lord Dartmouth that all royal governors should secure the arms and gunpowder that any Americans attempted to import. This led to riots in various places, but most importantly, for my purposes, it led to attacks on forts in 3 different New England colonies. First, as I said, the news came first to Rhode Island, so the first to respond were people in Rhode Island. The very day the news arrived, residents of Rhode Island attacked the fort in Newport and carried off 44 cannon in just 36 hours. There must have been a lot of them to have done that, although it's not revealed how many there were, but 44 cannon got carried off from the fort in Newport. Then a couple of days later, the same kind of thing happened in New London, Connecticut, where crowds reacted in the same way, and they moved cannon from their fort, storing big guns in 3 widely scattered locations so the British could never find them again. And then finally, in New Hampshire, where there was a royal governor, of course, the Rhode Island and Connecticut were charter colonies and had governors that were locally elected, so they were not trying to oppose what was happening. But the royal governor, John Wentworth, in New Hampshire made things different. Fort William and Mary in the harbor at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, it's still a military installation at the entrance to the harbor, was called the Castle, and Paul Revere arrived from Boston into Portsmouth with news of the order in council. Quickly, a false rumor spread that General Thomas Gage was sending troops from Boston to confiscate the cannon and muskets and the ammunition that were stored at the castle, and the crowd decided to attack the fort instead and to take all the stuff that was stored there. 300 or 400 men overran the fort. There were only about 6 soldiers defending it. They were imprisoned. The flag was taken down. 100 barrels of gunpowder was confiscated. Now, Governor Wentworth, when this happened, tried to muster the militia to defend the fort, but he couldn't. The militia, in fact, composed the mob, and so the militiamen would not muster, and there's actually a very sort of a sad, I would say, document in the record where the sergeant of the militia in Portsmouth says, "I walked around town, I beat the drum at every street corner," which is, of course, the signal for the militia to muster, and no one mustered. Nobody responded. So Wentworth was completely thwarted in his attempt to prevent this attack on the fort, and was thwarted eventually for his attempt to charge and punish those who were responsible. After these attacks in early December of 1774, everybody expected war in the spring, and they were right. And my book ends with a transcription of General Gage's order to the troops to go to Concord to destroy the arms and ammunition cache there. And that date was, as we all know, April 19th, 1775. And I will just show you the one picture we have of, to end, the one contemporary painting we have of the attack on the British attack on Concord in April of 1775. So with that, I will stop the screen sharing and I will be happy to answer any questions. And, all right. Yes, the question is, was the term loyalist about the term of the first loyalist? Yes, the first person I found to use it, I found using it was Jonathan Sewell, who was himself a loyalist. He was the Chief Justice of Massachusetts. No, he wasn't the Chief Justice. He was the Attorney General of Massachusetts at the time, and it did not appear in a publication. It appeared in a letter that he wrote to Lord Dartmouth. And he described himself and others as loyalists. So I don't know when it first appeared in a publication, probably a little bit later.
So there's another question there for you from Jerry Rosenthal.
Yes, the question is, why was Hutchinson so adamant about not allowing the tea ships to return to England? It seems he was itching for a fight. I think he was. He had been deeply hurt by the leaking of his private correspondence to England by Samuel Adams and others. And yes, he was itching for a fight. And this is certainly an argument that Bernard Bailyn makes in his biography of Hutchinson. He thinks that Hutchinson's refusal to allow the ships to leave was really the turning point. I think it actually came later, but that's Bailyn's argument. Why didn't open hostilities occur then instead of 4 months later? Basically, it was winter. It was New England winter. Nobody wanted to start a war in the middle of the winter. And in fact, there's the great Salem gunpowder raid, which occurred in February, which is kind of a dress rehearsal for what happened later in Concord, and where everybody just agrees we're not going to have a war now. It's when Gage sent out troops to Salem to confiscate gunpowder. No, it was too early. Everybody knew you had to wait till spring. You'd have to deal with muddy roads, but you wouldn't have to deal with heavy snow. On the eve of the hostilities, would you say that American Whigs were advocating regional autonomy within the empire as opposed to outright independence associated with the Second Continental Congress in early July 76? Actually, one of the arguments I make in the book, and I didn't have time to really talk about it now, is that I think Americans were really voting with their feet and had already in effect voted with their feet by the end of 1774. One of the indications of this is that the governors were extremely frustrated. They wrote to England saying, no one will obey anything I'm doing. All that people do is to obey the decrees of the First Continental Congress and of the associated committees and congresses in each of the colonies. And there's a wonderful quote that I found that I talk about in the book, where an essayist in Philadelphia in late October 1774, after the adjournment of the Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress, writes an essay and says, I hope I can live until 1876 to celebrate the centennial. And what are you celebrating a centennial of other than independence? And in fact, people all understood that at the time, and he took a lot of flack for having said that, but he said it. And so people were in fact thinking it as early as October of 74. And I think that by the end of 74 and the beginning of 75, even though they didn't admit it always to themselves, they were really operating independently. They were obeying their local congresses, they were obeying their local committees, and they were totally ignoring what their governors were telling them to do. I'm interested in the persuasive techniques the local committees of safety used. I have heard of one involving a barrel. Actually, the committees of safety don't exist until after the war starts. And they don't exist until after April of 75. And so I am not deeply familiar with the tactics that these committees of safety used. I turn you to look at sources for yourself to answer that question. I've never heard of one involving a barrel, but it's entirely possible. I mean, I think they did ride people on barrels. I mean, that was a kind of a standard punishment for people who misbehaved, not just for people who politically misbehaved, but people who personally misbehaved. But I have no idea if that's what you're talking about. Okay, why do you think 1774 has been so underreported? It's really interesting and a setup to the later events we know. Thanks. Well, I think that the people have taken the position of the radicals. They have not recognized how much debate was going on in 1774. If you only take the point of view of the radical proponents of revolution, you are basically assuming that once you get through the Boston Tea Party, you're going to get to the war, and you jump right over that period. I think that's it. I think it has to do with the teleological approach that many historians have taken to this period. And as I said in the very beginning of my talk, I tried not to do that. I tried to show specifically the debates that were occurring, not trying to understand what was going on, or not trying to assume that I knew what was going to happen, and instead giving equal time to everybody, both the conservatives who became loyalists, the conservatives who ultimately became revolutionaries, the moderates who switched in different ways, to give everybody a chance to talk, rather than simply privileging the people who led the revolution. I think that's why it's been skipped. I think it's a problem of historians writing teleologically, knowing how the story came out and wanting to explain how the story came out, rather than trying to figure out what was going on all the time, what was going on the ground at the time. Oh, that's a good question. Did this open the way for coffee to gain market share, or was it already popular? Coffee was not popular. And actually, I have not done this research myself, but I know someone who has. His name is James Fichter. He teaches at the University of Hong Kong, and he's doing a book on the tea trade in this period and the East India Company. And he says, actually, this is not true. Coffee did not become popular until later, much later in the 19th century. Tea resumes quite quickly after all of this, and people are still drinking tea through the end of the 18th century. It's well into the 19th century before coffee becomes popular. That's a great question, though.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Professor Norton, although I believe you can't hear me while I'm speaking, for a great talk. We hope you'll support a local bookstore. We always advocate for supporting the bookstore closest to the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is Trident Bookseller. They do have the book in stock, and you can order it from them today. You could also use bookshop.org, which is a website that feeds sales through independent bookstores. If you enjoyed the program and you have the ability to do so, we hope you'll also consider supporting the Massachusetts Historical Society and our work to make programs like this available to the public.